This is the most epic revenge story in history. The story of Jean de Clisson. It's the year 1300, and a baby girl with bright red hair is born to a small noble family in Brittany, France. Her parents name her Jean. When they look down at their beautiful baby, they probably think, jackpot. Back then, beauty was seen as very valuable, especially for noble families. So, when Jean grew up, her parents quickly arranged for her to marry a nobleman in exchange for a large piece of land. Jean was only 12 years old at the time, too young to understand what love really was. But she followed her parents' wishes, married the nobleman, had 2 children, and accepted that this was just how her life would be. However, 14 years later, her husband suddenly died. Now 26 years old, Jean was a single mother living in the Middle Ages. Being alone during that time was hard for women, so she needed to find another husband who could help take care of her and her kids. Luckily, she was still young and, according to the stories, very beautiful. Before long, she married again, this time to a man from Brittany's ruling family. But the family of Jean's new husband thought he would be better off marrying someone wealthier. So they convinced the Pope to cancel the marriage. Jean didn't give up, though. She later met and married another noble from Brittany named Olivier de Clisson. This time, things were completely different. Unlike most noble marriages, which were usually just for politics, Jean and Olivier actually fell deeply in love, lived a happy life. Jean had everything she could wish for: a loving husband, beautiful kids, wealth, and power. Life seemed perfect until 1341. That year, the Duke of Brittany died without choosing someone to take his place. A huge family fight over who should be the next duke turned into a long, brutal war called the Breton War of Succession, which lasted for 30 years. The kings of England and France saw a chance to gain more power. England supported John of Montfort, the duke's half-brother, while France supported the duke's niece and her husband, Charles de Blois. Jean and Olivier sided with the French and their king, Philip VI. Olivier fought bravely and even recaptured the city of Vannes for France. But the victory didn't last long. The English soon took the city back. Olivier and some other commanders were captured during the fighting. Strangely, Olivier was traded back to the French for a very small amount of money, which made many people in France suspicious. They started to think he might be a traitor. In 1343, the Pope stepped in and called for a break in the war. During this short truce, the French king invited Olivier and other Breton nobles to Paris for a tournament to celebrate the peace. Olivier thought this was a great idea and traveled to France. But as soon as he arrived, he was arrested and thrown in prison. He was accused of being a traitor and locked in a dungeon while waiting for his trial. Back in Brittany, Jean heard about what happened. She rushed to Paris, doing everything she could to save her husband, even trying to bribe the king's guards. But nothing worked. Olivier's trial was unfair from the start. In August, he was taken to the town square and publicly beheaded. His body was left hanging in Paris as a warning, and his head was sent back to Brittany, where it was placed on a spike for everyone to see. This was a terrible fate for anyone, but for a noble, it was the worst kind of humiliation. In Brittany, Jean took her 2 youngest sons to see their father's severed head, a moment that would haunt her forever. Jean forced her 2 youngest sons to stare at their father's pale, lifeless head. It had been dead for weeks, rotting and covered in flies. Inside, Jean was filled with rage, and she wouldn't let her children look away. They had to understand one thing: the king had to pay. At 43 years old, Jean made a vow to spend the rest of her life making King Philip's life a nightmare. She cut all ties with France and sold everything she owned: her land, her jewelry, and anything of value. With the money, she raised a small personal army. Her first target was Château de Tafou, a castle controlled by French loyalists. Jean approached the gates, crying loudly, pretending to be a heartbroken widow begging for shelter. The commander of the castle recognized her as a noble who supported Charles de Blois and allowed her in. But as soon as the gates opened, Jean's army rushed in and stormed the castle. The guards were caught by surprise, and Jean ordered her men to kill everyone inside. She spared just one man, giving him a message to deliver to King Philip. Jean didn't stop there. She continued to attack castles along the Normandy coast with her army. Eventually, she bought 3 warships, painted them all black, and dyed their sails a deep blood red. The Lioness of Brittany was ready to take her revenge to the seas. Jean named her flagship My Revenge and became a feared pirate, armed with a massive axe. she began terrorizing French merchant ships in the English Channel. She didn't care about stealing treasure. Her only goal was revenge on the French. Her attacks were brutal. Every crew she captured was slaughtered, and Jean personally beheaded any French nobleman she found with her axe. On each ship, she left one survivor alive to spread the terrifying story of what had happened. As news of her Black Fleet spread, the French king gave her a new name, the Lioness of Brittany. Soon, word reached the English, who saw Jean as a powerful ally against France. They quickly began funding her so she could keep attacking French ships. But Jean's reign couldn't last forever. In 1348, the French Navy finally tracked down her fleet. A brutal battle followed, and her ships were destroyed. The French soldiers boarded my revenge, but Jean was nowhere to be found. She had escaped in a small boat with a few loyal crew members. With no food or water, they drifted helplessly for 6 days. Some of her crew didn't survive the journey. Finally, on the 7th day, Jean washed ashore in England, half dead, but alive enough to continue ruining King Philip's lands. When Jean landed in England, she was welcomed as a respected ally by King Edward III. With her ships destroyed and her crew gone, Jean decided she was done with the pirate life. 2 years later, her enemy, King Philip VI, died, bringing that chapter of her life to a close. Like and subscribe.